Hi, I'm Anton Simanowicz with the Social Performance Task Force, and today I'm presenting to you the results of the survey work that we've been doing in partnership with Finca International and 60 Decibels, which looks at the impact of the COVID crisis on the clients of financial service providers. So we've been collecting data from 22 organisations across many countries, and the data has been collected relatively soon after lockdown in most countries, period between May and August. The 60 decibels data has been collected in July and August, so a little bit later. But mostly this data represents the situation in the months following the lockdown in most countries. In the coming months, we are going to be collecting data from clients from the same organisations to look at how the situation has changed and really inform organisations with an understanding of how the situation is evolving. So unsurprisingly, soon after lockdown, the main concerns of most clients has been around the impact on their income and work and their direct health impacts. Interestingly, in some countries, particularly Latin America, there's much greater focus on health, and this perhaps reflects the reality that the COVID impact has been much greater in Latin America. So, for example, in Peru and Ecuador, many clients report direct health impacts. Some 20% mention illness in their family, and sadly, some 4% mention deaths directly caused by COVID. It's clear that the clients of financial service providers have been severely impacted financially by the COVID crisis, with almost half saying that their financial situation is much worse than previously, and 90% are in a worse financial situation. Interestingly, the number that are being able to adjust to the crisis by finding new and additional work is fairly low, but we do see variations, for example, between older and younger clients, with 13% of older versus 7% of younger having been able to find a new or additional work, and differences between men and women, with 10% of men and 7% of women. And this raises some questions about the conditions that enable people to adjust to the crisis. So, for example, women perhaps having greater household care responsibilities, less time to adjust. Men perhaps having greater skills and higher employability. But these are questions, and they're going to be very specific to each different context. We see some really big variations by country in terms of the income impact from COVID. Most of the providers that have reported to the survey are lending to clients for their businesses, so we see a very strong link between the impact on businesses and the impact on income overall. But so, for example, in Paraguay, 70% of businesses were closed. In Kenya, 38% were not trading, and 50% were badly affected. Whereas in the Philippines, some 21% of businesses have remained the same as they were before the crisis. So we see local factors such as the lockdown, the local economy, government support really being important in terms of the different impacts in terms of income in different countries. One of the most shocking aspects of the crisis is how quickly and severely COVID has impacted on people's food security and hunger. So we're seeing that almost half of clients have seen decreases in their food consumption. There is some variation, but there is impact across all countries. And in a number of places, we're seeing that the impact is not just on the reduction of type or size of food consumed, but people are actually going hungry. There are perhaps differences between rural and urban populations, between poor and non-poor, between different segments affected differently, and we will be looking at that later in this presentation. So linked to the impact on income, on food security, is the increasing vulnerability of the clients of financial services. Uh, Financial providers target low-income people who have often working in the informal economy, who have erratic incomes, and they are particularly vulnerable to this COVID crisis. And we see that 54% of clients are now ranked as very vulnerable, and only 9% are seen as coping. And there are country differences, but again, this is something which is affecting people across the context. So how are clients coping? So we see a range of coping mechanisms, but the most important one by far is the use of savings. And this really highlights the value of savings for the clients in financial inclusion. And it also highlights the precariousness of the situation as we see a move, perhaps in some countries, to increasing selling assets. So most countries, in the time where we conducted these surveys, most clients had not started resorting to selling assets, but we see in a couple of countries, Peru and Nicaragua, quite high levels of selling assets and lower levels of access to savings. So this does raise questions about why is that the situation? Is it the severity of the impact in those countries? Is it the availability of savings to fall back on? But it does raise questions about the longer term impacts in terms of as clients use up their savings and start having to resort to the more severe coping mechanisms such as selling assets, what is the potential impact of these? Clearly, given the important role of access to financial services in people managing their financial lives, coping with the shock of COVID, investing in their future, access to cash is important. And we see quite a big variation in terms of clients reporting that it's harder to access cash when they need it. Potentially this is due to local situations such as organisations not being operational, lockdown situations, etc. But it's an important aspect to be aware of when thinking about financial service provider clients and the services that they provide. So up to now I've been talking a lot about the sort of overall impacts of COVID, and I want to move on now to thinking about the differences between client segments. One of the clear messages that we're seeing in the data is that not all clients are affected in the same way, and that to really understand the crisis and to be able to respond, it's important to understand the differences between different client segments. So we see a big difference in terms of employment type and subsector influencing the impact of the crisis. So in the retail trade, certain sectors that are providing essential goods such as personal care or food are less affected than those which are more prone to lockdown, such as electronics or clothing. Similarly, in the service sector, health services, telecommunication, and interestingly construction are less affected. Services such as hairdressing, clothing altering, tailoring clearly are going to be more affected. We also see a significant difference in the agriculture sector. Very interestingly, we see some 35% of clients reporting lower prices for their produce, which we don't see in other sectors, and perhaps that's something to do with the perishability of the agricultural products or access to market, etc. But clearly these differences raise questions, and they also raise opportunities for you as a provider to support clients in overcoming these challenges. I've mentioned already some of the differences between men and women. but we see gender as a factor that is really um, prevalent across all the indicators, with systematic differences between men and women in relation to the concern, the income, but most strikingly is the impact on food security and hunger, with women dramatically more affected than men. Um, and this perhaps relates to some of the issues that we often hear about in terms of women focusing on their children or their husbands in terms of distribution of food. We also see differences across age groups, with younger people less affected across all of these indicators. But as I mentioned earlier, we did see that men were more likely to be able to switch to new or alternative work sources. So this perhaps reflects a shorter term advantage for younger people, but perhaps a longer term advantage for older people. Again, these are questions which would need to be answered in your specific situation in terms of understanding what's going on for your clients. And finally, and importantly, in terms of thinking about the differences between clients, the 60 decibel data shows a very striking difference between those not living in poverty and those living in poverty, with people living in poverty suffering greater income source changes, reduction in income, having greater impact in terms of food security, and suffering a greater burden of the debt repayments that they have to repay to the financial providers. So it's a really important point to recognise that the poorer people are more vulnerable, they are affected more, and in thinking about how you respond to that in terms of expectations around loan repayments, this data around people experiencing burden of repayment is important to note. So as I said at the beginning, this data mostly represents the situation in the few months after lockdown. As I highlighted, the situation is changing, and it's really important to understand over time how it evolves so that you can respond to the changing needs of your clients. So we have some data from Uganda that's giving some early indications of the sort of changes that we might see. So in Uganda, we're seeing the overall levels of concern have gone down as the lockdown has eased and the economic situation has improved, and some movement from people very concerned to slightly concerned. The types of concerns have also changed, so there's been less of a sort of decreasing concern about the ability to work and income, and an increasing concern about sort of broader factors such as the economy and also the individual health of the individual and their family. We see less of a clear pattern around the sort of changes around income and food security, with again a gradual decrease, but some ups and downs, and we would need to understand a little bit more about what's happening locally, particularly in July, with increasing food insecurity, to really understand what is being driven by the COVID situation and what's affected by other factors. So I've given you an overview of the data. In the forthcoming workshop, we are going to be looking at this data in more detail and really focusing in on how do you understand the situation of your specific clients, what are the differences that you see, and how can you respond as an organization. So in preparation for this workshop, we are suggesting that you discuss these 5 questions within your organization, and look at the data that you have collected and start thinking about it from this perspective. So the first question is around the global aggregate findings that I presented. and how does that compare with what your data is telling you about your clients? What are the similarities that you see? What are the differences? Within your data, I've highlighted the importance of recognizing that the crisis doesn't affect all people in the same way. So what differences do you see? What subsectors are particularly affected, and do you understand why? Who is particularly affected? Is it women, men, poorer people, elderly? Are there differences that you see? And what are the factors that would account for the differences that you see in your context? Do you know, or is there additional information that you would need to collect, and what would that be? And finally, I've highlighted the impact of people using up their savings, the risk that people are selling assets, and the increasing vulnerability that we're seeing. So yes, restructuring moratoria will help in the short term, but the big question that we need to think about is what can be done in the longer term to support a sustainable recovery for your clients. So we look forward to discussing these with you in the workshop in the coming days.